Hello and welcome to Lesson 7 of Changing Cities. We're going to start this session off once again by looking at some of the key terms you're going to be encountering in the session by using some dingbats. So these ones are nice and easy. Here we go. Okay, that one is core. The next one also very easy. This one is frame. Okay, the next one. This one not easy. Okay, I'm going to reveal the answer. So if you've not got it yet, please make sure you've paused the screen. This is the zone of assimilation. I'll let you work out how that's been achieved. Next. Okay, this one is the zone of discard. And the last one. This does require you to have a little bit of knowledge of The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. Okay, this one is decentralisation. Again, I'll let you work out how we got to that particular word. Alright, so your title is coming up. Please make sure you write this down. We are going to be looking today at the changes in retailing and the CBD of Norwich specifically. So, by the end of this session, you will have knowledge of what we mean by the core and frame CBD model. You'll also look at how Norwich has changed specifically over the years with regards to its retail and the impact that's had on the city. And also we're going to look at ways that Norwich has been fighting back against that concept or that idea of decentralisation, those waves of decentralisation. We've already kind of covered some aspects of this when it looked at the deindustrialisation, when we looked at the deindustrialisation of Norwich and some of the impacts with regards to maybe the closing down of the Gerald's paper mill or the Rowntree Nestle chocolate factory, for example. But we're going to look at more specifically the CBD today. Okay, so if you've got that title, please feel free to carry on now. If not, make sure you do get it. So the core and frame model, and this is something which I'd like you to jot down some of the information as well. Norwich has changed in terms of its retail over the last 40 years, and that has impacted many parts of the city, and it's led to inequality, like we've seen in the past, and like we've looked at in previous lessons. So that inequality is down to deindustrialisation and also this idea of decentralisation, which is one of those four specific causes of deindustrialisation. Now, decentralisation happens in many waves, and it has done over Norwich's history, and we're going to look at four main waves today about why that's occurred. But before we do, you need to know about this idea of the core and frame model. So take the CBD of any city, the middle portion where the historic buildings are and the business areas are and the shops are, that can actually be divided itself into three of its own main sections. So the very middle part of the CBD is what we'd call the inner core of the CBD. Then outside that you've got the outer core, and then the kind of very edge of the CBD we kind of call the frame area. And that can look like, well, a model I'm about to show you, which is here. So this is the core and frame model, and like any model, there are inaccurate parts, there are bits that don't fit Norwich or the place you're looking at specifically. There are places where obviously it fits really well, but don't use this as a particular say. Don't think and say, that can't be in the core because actually that's meant to be in the frame, and that's not always the case. Okay, so there will be exceptions. But just to kind of give you a general idea, you've got these three main areas: your inner core in red here, your outer core in yellow, and your frame in blue. Remember, this is all part of the CBD. And then you've also got these kind of two zones. You've got a zone of assimilation, I'll explain that in a second, and a zone of discard. And next to those two zones, you've got these kind of housing or industrial areas A and B. So let's go through each of these particular sections to explain it to you. The inner core is often where you'd find your department stores, specialist shops, high-rise office blocks, commercial offices like banks, for example, and there are a number of banks in what we'd call Norwich's inner core area. So you've got a lot of them on Gentleman's Walk, like Lloyd's TSB, for example, and you'll find that in this sort of right in the middle of Norwich's CBD. You'll also find department stores. You've got Gerald's there in the middle, and places like markets you'll also find there, if it's a market town like Norwich is, or city, sorry. Then slightly sort of further out from that, you'll often, and again not always, find things like insurance companies, like Norwich Union, for example, solicitor firms that you'll find there's a few of them knocking around the Tombland area, public administration buildings, so often things like city halls and stuff like that, although Norwich City Hall, you could argue, is probably in the inner core. You'll find theatres and cinemas. Good examples, you've got Norwich Theatre Royal and Cinema City. They're both found in the outer core, so still within the CBD, and maybe smaller shops as well. Then the frame area, this is where you'll find your multi-storey car parks, so places like, for example, St Andrews is a good example, and Rose Lane. They are located very much on the frame of Norwich's CBD. Transport terminals as well, so the bus station, again on Surrey Street, very, very close to the CBD. Sorry, it is in the CBD, but right on the edge of the CBD. Light manufacturing, so maybe some factories if they still exist there. Education services. This is where you'll find places like Notre Dame High School, for example, just on the very outskirts of the CBD of Norwich. So Notre Dame you can walk to if you live in the city, and it's very, very close actually to the bus station, which is a good kind of way of remembering where what kind of school is appropriate. But also, I mean, you could argue that Norwich High School for Girls, which is kind of located west of the city of Norwich, could arguably be kind of on the outskirts of the CBD, but maybe City College Norwich is a better example, and maybe the Jane Austen College as well. Good examples of where you'll find education services in the CBD. So that's your general kind of three areas of your inner core, your outer core, and your frame. And again, there are exceptions. Please don't use this as what every city should be like. But then you've got these two zones. So the first thing is I'll take your zone of discard. Now, that won't necessarily always be in the very northeast corner of a city. That's just for illustration purposes only. But the zone of discard, what it means is, within the CBD somewhere, often sort of on the outskirts, are areas where old industry has been kind of discarded. If you discard something, you kind of throw it away, you leave it somewhere. And this will be old, tired, out of use things. You throw away things that you no longer use. So these zones of discard are where parts of the city centre are kind of getting a bit run down, a bit dilapidated. And this would have applied to the Riverside area of Norwich before they redeveloped it, and the Chapelfield, so the old chocolate factory, before again they redeveloped it. And next to that zone of discard, because it's normally associated with terraced housing, because again it's often old factories that you'll find in this zone of discard through deindustrialisation, you'll find the terraced houses which were built to house the workers that worked in those factories, and they are often poor quality housing, low quality residential houses, and maybe heavy industries there. So that's the zone of discard. But very, very quickly, and happening more quickly than ever really, is those areas often turn into these areas, zones of assimilation, places that have been redeveloped. So think of Chapelfield now and think of Riverside now. Those areas that were discarded, run down, out of use, and the houses around them which were a bit poor quality, have been redeveloped into new areas, more modernised areas with better quality residential properties. Either they've knocked down the old rubbish ones, or they've redeveloped them or improved them and gentrified the area a little bit. So there you go, there's the core and frame model, and what you need to do is get onto 365, because there are some resources which look a bit like this, which I'd like you to use, and it's got images, for example, that talk to you about the different areas. So it got, for example, theatres and cinemas. There you go, there's Theatre Royal there. You've got public administration, so City Hall, and examples of places in Norwich where you will find like commercial offices or department stores, but also and the bus station, for example, down here, transport networks, multi-storey car parks. There's St Andrews, and there's the bus station. But you'll also find these other little areas of zones of assimilation, and good quality housing, and zones of discard with maybe sort of poorer quality or heavy industry. So you've got Sovereign House here near Anglia Square. So what I'd like you to do is, using the statements on the next slide, but again, if they're not on 365, please just use the ones on the next slide, to just try and annotate around where the statement should be kind of going on your map. So what you've got here Okay, there's lots on here, and there's specifically lots on there because there's specific Norwich information weaved in. What I'd like you to do is try and match these to the area that they belong. So, for example, the first one I'll do for you, the inner core, and this is where the inner core goes. This area contains the largest department stores like Debenhams and shopping centres like Castle Mall, or the Castle Quarter as it's called now. Specialist shops and high-rise office blocks, banks are found here like Lloyd's. Okay, so I mentioned that near the market. Now in Norwich, the Norwich specific information are Debenhams, Castle Mall or Castle Quarter, and Lloyd's Bank. Okay, that you can highlight once you've worked out it's the inner core. So if it's not already on a handout for you to cut and stick or to just transfer across, please write it out in full so you've got all the information, and then highlight some of the key information that's to do with Norwich specifically. Okay, so pause the screen, get on with that. It should take you probably, to write it all out, if you're doing that, it'll probably take you about 10 to 15 minutes, but it should take you a little while just to complete that information. Okay, when you're ready, unpause the screen and I'll go through the answers for you. Okay, so the zone of discard is where some parts of the CBD are retreating, firms are closing because the property's old or cramped, there's competition from elsewhere, all those things that we linked in with deindustrialisation last session. Anglia Square, for example, good example of that, Sovereign House that's been dilapidated and it's old and run down, is a zone of discard. Older shopping areas where rents are too high but shops are kind of closed or lie empty, so again, very much Anglia Square. Houses around that area are often older, terraced houses, bit run down, fairly high density, low quality houses. And again, Magdalen Street, right next to Anglia Square, very much signifies that. There's quite a few run down houses just under that overpass bit of the main road, the ring road. So that's a zone of discard in Norwich. But again, like any zone of discard, there are plans to redevelop that massively. And they've been in the pipeline for a number of years now, but we should start to see them coming to fruition within the next few years at least. So the transport networks bit, that is to do with the frame. So I've mentioned like the VW garage, Mercedes and Honda near Halfords, St Andrews multi-storey car park, Norwich bus station, that sort of stuff. The outer core is the bottom right statement, so smaller shops, Norwich Theatre Royal's there, Norwich City Hall technically is there, and the zone of assimilation. So where the CBD is expanding, old former housing areas are maybe being reused, repurposed, assimilated, weaved in, and even derelict areas may be being reused as well. So good example, the Den Team, which is a former residential building on Earlham Road near the UEA. Fashionable modern housing, again, often associated with redeveloped areas like Riverside or Chapelfield, and also modern tower blocks with good views. You could argue not very good views of the area along Grapes Hill, but they've just built new student accommodation which looks pretty nice actually, just next to Grapes Hill, which has taken advantage of the sort of old dilapidated land next to Grapes Hill in the kind of frame area of Norwich. Okay, so there you go. There's a good summary really of how Norwich specifically links to the core and frame model, and hopefully you understand those different terms of zone of assimilation, zone of discard as well. Alright, so now we're going to move on to decentralisation specifically, which we encountered last session, remember, and there's a reminder there in italics of what decentralisation is: the movement of people, businesses, retail and factories away from the city centre to the edge of the city, so decentralising it. Now what you've got here are four kind of key images which explain or link to the different waves of decentralisation that have occurred in Norwich. Again, very specifically Norwich. Not all of these images are from Norwich, okay, this one isn't and this one isn't, but they should give you clues as to the ways in which decentralisation has affected Norwich over the years. So have a little look at that. Again, hopefully you recognise a couple of them. This one we used a couple of lessons ago. This is the old Cayley's chocolate factory, and then you've got Longwater here as well. But what does this represent? What do you think this represents, for example? Okay, and we're going to cover those four waves on the next slide. So unfortunately there's a lot of note taken on the next slide. You will need to write it all down, so please have your pens at the ready. So decentralisation in Norwich has occurred in four main waves, as it kind of has in many cities in the UK. The first wave, this wave occurred because people moved away from the city centre, that's decentralisation, but the reason they did was purely because the suburbs were developing at that time. So think about that process of suburbanisation. It's the outward flow of people from the city centres into maybe bigger houses, less polluted areas with a bit more green space, bigger gardens, that sort of thing. So that was the first wave of decentralisation in Norwich. The second wave was as a result of manufacturing being moved away. So we've talked about the Startright factory a couple of times, and we've talked about the Cayley's or Roundtree Nestle chocolate factory. That's because of deindustrialisation, I should say. So the first one is movement of people away to decentralise Norwich. The next one was movement of manufacturing away. Again, good examples of Norwich-based case studies there. The third wave was retail moving out. So retail and Norwich's changing retail picture is really this third wave of decentralisation. Lots of places that required maybe larger stores decided they'd get cheaper premises next to main roads outside the city centre, and Longwater is a really good example of that. You've got Pizza Hut there, you've got the Range, you've got M&S Food, you've got like Smith's Toys. There's a lighting company there as well. There's Pets at Home. There's all sorts of different retail industries that have taken advantage of cheaper land close to large roads outside the city centre, and have moved away from kind of inner city areas. You don't find many Pets at Homes in Norwich city centre currently. You don't find lots and lots of examples of the Range in Norwich city centre at all, because they require bigger premises. Although historically you may have seen maybe one or two of these different industries. I don't think, I might be wrong, but I don't think there is actually a Pizza Hut in Norwich city centre. Whereas actually, there's Pizza Huts historically were in city centres, but they've moved outside because again they can get bigger premises near retail areas. Okay, and the final wave of decentralisation, which is kind of ongoing really, is because of the growth of internet shopping. People don't need to go into the city anymore. They can just get what they want online, and if they don't like it, they send it back, all free, no problem. And also online shops, high street shops are cottoning onto this and realising that actually if they've got an online presence, they will make more money and sell more. And so there's been a massive success in companies like Amazon, but also specific companies like H&M, for example, have got good online services to order clothes from them. So you don't even need to go into the city centre to order your clothes. You can order it in 3 different sizes, send the 2 back that don't fit, or if you don't like it, send them all back. It's nice and easy. It saves you having to park and the hassle of looking at it and stuff. And a lot of people blame the death of the inner city areas on internet shopping, but this is the current threat really to retail in any city centre. So what I need you to do, please, is pause the screen while you write all of that down. Make sure you've got all of the different waves of decentralisation and you understand how they have affected Norwich over time. And then we're going to move on to the next section. So pause the screen and I'll move on now. Okay, so because of all this decentralisation, that can obviously have massive implications for the number of jobs and the money that can be generated in any town or city centre. So what are Norwich doing to fight back? Well, I've got some examples, and they're always, all cities are fairly dynamic in trying to keep the city centre alive and thriving, but Norwich specifically has done a few things. So I'm going to give you some dates and some just key ideas about when these things happened. So back in the year 2000, well before you were born, I imagine, unless you're like unless you're a 20-odd-year-old watching this, I don't know why you are. But in the year 2000, when I was just a young lad of 14, the Riverside development opened. Now, Riverside, as you know it now, around the Carrow Road, the Norwich City Stadium, didn't look like that originally. It didn't have, a big cinema and pubs and bars and nice houses and big blocks of sort of plush penthouse flats by the river. Norwich City Football Ground itself was surrounded by pretty horrible derelict land. And I remember going to my first Norwich games as a young lad thinking, this is not a place I'd want to find myself on a dark night. Nowadays it's nice and safe, there's loads to do, it's really fun, and there's loads of restaurants, etc. And that happened in 2000, so I remember in my lifetime the stark change, and it's been changing for many, many years since, and it's just grown and grown and grown. So there you go, that's just one example of the Riverside area looking over across, I don't know if Norwegian Blue still exists, but you've got the Queen of Iceni pub there, which is a Wetherspoons pub. You've got the cinema there, the Odeon Cinema, I think it is, and then you've got all these other little bars here like Squares and stuff like that. Again, varying bars that change and have changed over time, but they're still there, and it's quite nice, all lit up at night next to the river. It's a lovely little place to be. So that was Riverside in 2000. In 2001, the Forum opened. Now, you might know the Forum, and a lot of you might know it as just sort of a place to go and have pizza at Pizza Express, but it's the Norwich's library essentially, but they turned it into a kind of a multi-use area. And the Forum itself, which originally burned down, actually Norwich's library burned down in 1994, and it was a big issue actually at the time because it had loads of historic books which just were lost basically as a result of the fire. So they pledged to kind of rebuild it, and although it was pretty expensive, the Forum is quite a nice part of the city really, and it's a good place to kind of congregate. And you can see from this image here, this is before Run Norwich, which is an event I take part in every year. It's brilliant, or when it's on anyway. And you can see that it's a great congregation space. It's a lovely building, even though it cost a blooming fortune. It's still great, and it's a brilliant library. But also it's got things like up on this floor you've got Pizza Express, dining tables. There's a cafe down here. There's BBC studios up here. You can see just the BBC knocking around there. So this is a great multi-purpose building right next to City Hall. So that is a really kind of good example of how the CBD has fought back to try and encourage people. And look, it's clearly worked, certainly with events like Run Norwich as well, but getting them into the city again. In 2005, this is kind of now entering your lifetime probably, the Chapelfield Shopping Centre opened, where the old factory was. Now, I don't actually remember the old chocolate factory at all, but it's because I had no need to go there when I was younger. If I went to Norwich, I either went to Norwich City to watch football, or I went into the city centre near the market. There wasn't Chapelfield Shopping Centre to go to, so you didn't tend to really go to that area of the city. It was just a derelict area. But now it's probably a lot of your guys' go-to place to go to the shops, because they're probably the nicest shops. They've got the best kind of brands of high street fashion shops there to go. So Chapelfield, which again you can see there, it's got all the eateries at the top as well, but a really good. I mean, it's changed a lot since then. Cafe Rouge is no longer there. I think that's an escape rooms currently, but it's still there, and it's again been since 2005, and maybe not going strong, but it's still just about okay. I think House of Fraser might be leaving there soon. Now, 2011, again, you might not really mind this so much, and you might not agree, but Norwich has regularly been rated in the top 10 shopping cities of the UK, and it's not just because of Chapelfield and Castle Mall, less Anglia Square, but that'll change soon. But also, it's because of its thriving independent shops. And Elm Hill is a great example. You've got these lovely little specialist shops in this pretty little twee timber-framed house area. And there's like a tiny little, I don't know what shop this is, but there's a little bookshop that might even be there. But there's a little toy shop and very tiny specialist shops. And there's loads of them around that area. You've got the Head in the Cloud shops, the skating shops, all that sort of stuff that are all located around Norwich. Norwich has got a really good independent retail scene, which makes it a go-to place if you like the physical act of going shopping and potting around the cobbled streets. And in 2011 as well as being Norwich was, I'm not joking, the 6th most visited city by tourists in England in 2011. That might amaze you, but it's true. After London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, all big historic cities with a lot of attractions, Norwich was 6th after those. So it beat places like Bristol and Sheffield and all these sort of thriving English cities. And it's also a UNESCO City of Literature. So it's got this massive kind of status, really, and you can see this really happy lady. I probably should know who it is, but I don't. It's a World City of Literature. And Norwich has kind of given rise to several globally, renowned authors. And that's why kind of it helped it get this UNESCO World City of Literature status. And it's also quite famous. You might not know this, and I did a tour of Norwich, which helped me kind of learn this information, even as a resident learning things new. Apparently, it's the first book ever written in English by a female was a nun called Lady Julian who lived in Norwich. Again, I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's a great stat if it is true. Lady Julian, the first woman ever to write a book in English, was from our fine city. Okay, And lastly, another way to encourage pedestrians and people to come and walk around Norwich is to pedestrianise it. Make it a safe place for them to be. People love walking around and they don't want to be walking and crossing roads when it's dangerous. Lots of parts of Norwich have been pedestrianised. Again, in my lifetime, Gentleman's Walk was pedestrianised. So between the market and the Lloyd's Bank and all those shops there, it used to be a road that cars would regularly be driving down. It's a busy part of Norwich, but they pedestrianised it years and years and years ago and made it a place where people just walked now, other than if you're unloading stuff. And they've done the same with parts of Tombland and St Stephen Street, just to make it a better place for pedestrians to come and visit shops, really, and make it safer. So this area, this is just off St Stephen Street, but this is an area they very recently pedestrianised, just near the John Lewis department store. And now you used to be able to drive down here, drive past onto St Stephen Street, but now it's just pedestrians only. So again, it's a much nicer, much safer area for people to be walking on. So there you go. That is how Norwich has fought back, and the CBD has fought back to encourage people in. Hopefully, that will start to counter some of the decline in sales that have been brought about by the rise of internet shopping. I'd always rather go into the city to do my shopping. But that said, with coronavirus as well, which is something which hopefully will not last forever, but that has also impacted the city centre too. So hopefully Norwich can recover and the CBD can still be thriving in future. Now, the last two things we're just going to finish off on are a right, wrong and impossible task. I've got an easy one for you here, just to remind you what you need to do. Answer the question, identify the right answer, the wrong answer and the impossible answer, and for the wrong and impossible answers, try and give a reason for why they are wrong or impossible. So, which part of the core and frame models for CBD structure would you find theatres, cinemas and arenas? Pause the screen if you don't want the answer to be revealed. Okay, the right answer is the outer core, the wrong answer is the inner core, and the impossible answer is decentralisation, because it's not actually part of the core and frame model. And this one is a bit more difficult. Which cause of deindustrialisation, so this is looking back at last lesson, is the process by which cities become part of the world market and things are being spread around the world? So again, pause the screen until you've come up with your decision, and then unpause and I'll reveal the answer. Alright, so the answer to this is globalization. You should have known that from last session. The wrong answer is decentralization, which is a concept that we covered in this session, which is the movement of industry away from the city to the outskirts. Or people as well, that could be part of decentralisation. And the impossible answer is deprivation, because that is not a cause of deindustrialisation at all. That is an impact of deindustrialisation. Okay, so that is lesson 7 completed. Well done, and I'll see you next time for lesson 8, which is going to be looking at Norwich and sustainability. Thank you for listening.